everyone, and welcome to Energy Transition Trends, where we review the goings-on across the energy transition universe. Now, 2020 was clearly a breakout year for energy transition equities, with fundamental earnings growth very strong and valuations re-rating to reflect the long-term, more visible opportunity ahead. Now, towards the end of the year, valuations had reached all-time highs, and certainly in certain subsectors we've worried had become slightly extended in the short term despite the positive long-term opportunity. And as such, we'd actually rotated the portfolio into slightly more defensive sectors to manage the potential risks of drawdown going forward. And indeed, at the start of 2021, we have started to see some weakness and volatility across the space, particularly in areas like solar, hydrogen, and renewable generation, where valuations had started to maybe run slightly too hot in the short term. Now, we've actually used this weakness as an opportunity to layer back into names that we fundamentally liked, but where valuations had started to look a little bit challenging. And the reason for this is that the long-term visibility behind the energy transition has arguably never been stronger, both despite and because of COVID. Renewables are currently the cheapest form of power generation globally across 3/4 of the world and are only getting cheaper. Policy support has never been more aligned and never been stronger. For the first time ever, we've entered a calendar year whereby US, Europe and China all have net zero carbon goals, and together they account for 75% of all emissions globally. And consumer demand for clean technologies is certainly starting to pick up as well. More and more consumers want to drive electric vehicles, have residential solar on their roofs, and use clean energy technologies. So the fundamental visibility behind the space is incredibly strong, and the long-term outlook has never been stronger. And certainly we've been using recent weakness to layer into some of the long-term best-in-class leaders across the space. Now, as a reminder, when we look at the energy transition universe, we're really thinking about 5 key subsectors and themes. These are clean energy generation, transmission and distribution, energy storage, energy efficiency, and clean mobility. And certainly when we look at this landscape at the moment, we're starting to see really exciting growth across all these areas. Particularly interesting at the moment are probably transmission and distribution. With the events that we've seen in Texas recently, investment in the grid clearly needs to pick up, and companies who are providing EV charging infrastructure, critical grid components, and also grid software are certainly very interesting. Given the recent weakness in solar, we've also started to see a really interesting risk reward there, and have certainly been layering back into some of those names. And also clean mobility is incredibly exciting at the moment. We're seeing new EV models starting to come to the market, and consumer demand for these models and EV penetration rates are starting to pick up, particularly in Europe, where towards the end of last year, we were starting to reach double-digit penetration rates across Europe as a whole, which is certainly really exciting. And these are the names that have started to be performing in our portfolios as well. We've certainly been looking at names that have that clean mobility exposure and are really driving the shift in our mobility system and pushing electric vehicle usage. We've also been looking at names which I say are fundamental to building out that grid, whether it be cables to offshore wind farms or increased cables and smart distribution software for the grid. And as I say, we've been looking again as well at some of the solar names that again we fundamentally like long term, where valuations had started to get extended, but actually after the recent weakness have started to pull back, because solar, both at the residential and utility scale, is going to be hugely important to driving the energy transition going forward.